The notion of art history as a coherent trans-historical narrative is rather redundant these days. I want this to be a critique of the traditional narrative that we use and an attempt to explore linguistics as much as the images as well. We're starting with classical Greek sculpture. And we begin here with the kouros, an archaic Greek sculpture which means youth. It's a depiction of an ideal male form, youthful, vigorous, and somewhere between both ideal and real. But this is not a traditional history. This is a discussion about language. It's a discussion about the language we use when we talk about art. Well, what are we supposed to say about this when we've never seen it before? When I approach a new sculpture, regardless of whether it's classical Greek, Renaissance, or from any other period, these are the key components I like to consider. Some will be more relevant than others, depending on the work, but they're all worth consideration in the first instance. In this case, the kouros is slightly larger than life size. It has two primary viewpoints. Indeed, the first thing I'd say about this is that it's a freestanding male nude in the round with a frontal emphasis. It's carved from a block of Parian marble, local to Greece, and its pose is rigid, almost militaristic. It has a static quality, despite its legs being apart. Gesture generally refers to hand gesture in the history of art. Here, you can see the fists are clenched down by his sides. His facial expression is rather blank. Indeed, it's almost expressionless. It's hard to tell if his eyes are closed or open. We have to infer that they are open. But the face is so diagrammatic, so schematic, so decorative. It has its own almost mystical quality. It's clearly a human being, but it also has an ideal symmetry, which is not quite human. There is surface detail. Indeed, there's clearly an attempt to create accurate anatomy. A broad chest, a navel, an attempt to differentiate the chest from the ribs, from the tummy. We can see the famous iliac crest differentiating the torso from the legs. And we can see an attempt to show the illusion of muscle over the knee bone. So clearly, this is an attempt to join the ideal and the real. When describing a sculpture in art history, you might want to consider the following ideas. Take them down now for future reference. Now, looking down the list, the one thing we need to get out of the way at the outset is the idea, the misconception, that classical Greek sculpture was unpainted. Indeed, generally speaking, they were painted to make them look more lifelike. This applies to buildings too. And the idea of a monochrome vision of art history needs to be exploded at the outset. What purposes did sculptures like these serve? What did they mean? Well, they were votive offerings, grave markers if you like, and they embodied somewhere between the divine and the human. The Greeks didn't distinguish between physical features of men and gods, so their ideal images like these needed to appear somewhere between. Socrates is reported to have said of statues that the quality of seeming alive has the strongest visual appeal. However, Plato, departing from Socrates, said that to make innovations or to create forms other than the traditional ones was wrong. Plato disliked the idea of departing from a divine idea or form. So we can see that both the history of Western art and Western philosophy has hinged on the question of divine and human. A youth like this would have been both an infantryman, a member of elite society, and in peacetime he would have competed at the Olympic Games. So whereas human beings are capable of this kind of ideal form momentarily, the gods look like this eternally. Where did an image like this derive from? Because it didn't come out of nowhere. Indeed, you may be wondering, why have I started here? Well, traditional histories of Western art tend to start around about this point, the archaic Greek period. But a sculpture like this derives heavily from the monumental Egyptian sculptures, whose proportions were generally more distorted than this. Here you can see the head is probably too large for the body. But in terms of realism, it's an advance on Egyptian precedent. To some extent, the art and architecture of Greece inverted the internalized tradition of Egyptian art and architecture, exposing the beauty, the decoration onto the outside. And this ties in and is harnessed by philosophers like Aristotle, who viewed external appearances and beauty as an indicator of inner virtue and moral rectitude. And the culture of archaic moving into classical Greece was heavily mercantile. It was competitive. And you have a sense of artists competing in order to construct a more lifelike form. Under Solon's 6th century constitution, individuals like craftsmen, as well as farmers, traders, and so on, were capable of achieving high status in government, in society. So to some extent, the individual was valued like never before. And the power of creating individual features that look lifelike seems to have been a task at the heart of the art. This figure of Croesus is a similar form to the Kouros we saw before. But you can see it's actually more lifelike in many respects. Across the torso, you can see abdominal muscles, visible through a clear layer of skin. The navel is more convincing. The face is more lifelike. Indeed, we see what's called the archaic smile, a symbol of life internalized. We can see that this sculpture is still static, still stuck in its military ways. Indeed, the idea of life being symbolized rather than actualized is clearly evident here. But looking in the details, everything is more real. It's almost like Socrates was the inspiration for a new stream of consciousness in art making. Now, as I've said before, this is not going to be a traditional history of art, but it's impossible to discuss classical Greece without its inherently gendered nature. An elite male like this on the left would have outranked slaves and women in society. And it's impossible to ignore the disparity and the elevation of masculine ideals to the forefront of consciousness, and to the air of superiority that the Greeks carried around with them. This peplos chore, robed young woman, is an example of the female equivalent to the Kouros in the 6th century BCE. You can see she's clothed in the peplos, the simple garment tied at the waist, and has a columnar form. She's painted. She looks lifelike. She has that archaic smile. She's from the same age as Croesus. But the notion of ideal virtue embodied through nakedness was the preserve of the male gender alone. And it's not until the 4th century BC that we see the nude female figure unwrapped. You can see here that the anatomy of the Korea is concealed, hinted at. It's an image of concealment, of propriety, of subjugation by men. The Critios boy moves us into a new phase. He's the earliest extant, the earliest surviving example of a contrapposto in Western art history. A contrapposto, literally meaning a counterpose, shows the legs in different positions, one engaged and static, and one free, liberated. It creates an asymmetry, which creates the impression that this sculpture can balance on his own. Not only that, his upper body is liberated by the fact that his lower body is free to roam. This is arguably the first surviving work of art which shows man as he or she truly is, mobile, independent. And unlike the Kouros, he doesn't have the same diagrammatic quality to the body and to its anatomy. There's an organic quality here that's new, that's fresh, that's liberated. These are the characteristics that we come to associate with the self-consciousness characteristic of classical Greece. Hence, this is the first work of the early classical period that we're discussing. This is actually smaller than life size. It's a young man. It's not heavily emphasizing the musculature, the abdominals. He's not clearly militaristic either. There's something languid, elegant, relaxed, calm, reflective. This isn't a statement of military superiority, so much as one of reflective self-consciousness. Is this the most important image in the history of man? Your words, not mine. A comparison of the Critios boy with this Roman copy of a Greek original on the right, the Discobolus of Myron, the discus thrower, shows up the differences between marble and bronze as materials. You'll notice that all of the marble sculptures considered so far are rather rigid, vertical. They're limited by the confinement of the block, however special that block is. Marble was used to support buildings. It was a building material, and it had high compressive strength. You could detail the anatomy, and the material allowed for detailed shallow carving. It was hard, but as you can see from the amputations of time, marble also has a low tensile strength, and it suffers under tension, in the same way that marble buildings suffer in high winds. By contrast, bronze has a high tensile strength, meaning that you can have poses, gestures that are unsupported. The discus thrower is the ultimate statement of bronze's high tensile strength. A complex twisting contrapposto, a serpentine pose, with the upper body twisting one way and the lower the other, making light of marble's limitations. Bronze was considered the more noble medium because it was a difficult medium to use. The lost wax process of casting allows you one chance to get it right. Throughout art history, bronze has always been considered the noblest medium. And Greek prototypes were valorized by the Romans for what they embodied: dynamism, athleticism, courage, but also self-consciousness, self-awareness, intelligence, superiority. The Romans took the Greeks' air of cultural superiority and made it their own, turned it into a system. Here you can see two periods following after the Kritios Boy, following after the early classical. On the left, a sculpture known as Canon, C-A-N-O-N. Polyclitus Doryphorus, meaning his spear bearer, is often considered to be the canon of classical Greek sculpture. What do I mean by canon? Well, it embodies a superior set of values, the ideal form, reflecting an ideal mind and an ideal culture. The body is 7 times the head, which was supposedly a more accurate proportion. Indeed, Polyclitus wrote about symmetry and rhythm as the defining features of classical sculpture. Here, Doryphorus, a military figure, is shown in a more interesting, more subtle contrapposto than the Kritios Boy. He's about to move. He's about to move off. He's thinking. He's in the process. He's static. He's carved out of marble. And yet, he seems about to break forth from it. The join between the arm and the right thigh reinforces the fragilities of the medium itself. But Polyclitus nonetheless polishes his form up to the point of splendor. And here we see an idealized male form embodying, if not mine, then a high classical image of divine perfection, made man. But if we move 100 years on into the late classical period, you start to see more interesting compositions. Here we have a god, 2 gods to be precise, the Hermes and the infant Dionysus. I sometimes wonder whether this is a prototype of the Madonna and Child seen in Christian imagery later. But either way, Praxiteles developed a different ideal to Polyclitus. To simplify, his figures are more elongated, perhaps more elegant, I'd say more human. Their bodies are generally 8 heads high rather than 7, which is actually closer to what we are. As Albrecht Dürer famously said in the early 16th century, "What ideal beauty is, I know not, but it existeth in many things." Perhaps to attempt to systematize beauty, to put it into one canon, was a fool's errand. But you can see the Greeks were preoccupied with this ambition throughout their history. Praxiteles is crucial, not only for the ideal he represents, but also for introducing the first female nude in the history of Western art, which is known as the Aphrodite of Cnidus. The Aphrodite of Cnidus has an interesting story. Indeed, she's derived from the Phoenician goddess of fertility and sexual love, Astarte. As we saw with the Chorere, female figures in Greek art were originally clothed, but here we see Praxiteles unclothe the female figure. But is this an act of liberation? Hardly. This is another reinforcement of the subjugation of women by men. How do we know? Well, there's a tension between modesty and shame, what the Greeks called eidos, and seduction. Aphrodite conceals herself, and yet it's also seductive. It's designed to titillate. And this tension between modesty and seduction continues throughout the history of art. And that pose, what's known as the Vetus pudica, the Vetus of modesty or shame, repeats and repeats throughout both painting and sculpture in art history. Praxiteles created the archetype of a woman, divine, yet controlled, subjected to a male gaze despite her divinity. Our final image is rather different. Indeed, the Hellenistic period, which begins with the death of Alexander the Great, embodies the period of classical Greece's highest geographical expansion. At this point in art history, there are a lot of private commissions available to artists who are competing to produce more complex, more emotive compositions. In this famous marble copy of a bronze original, 3 different sculptors combine to conjure images of 3 different suffering figures, the father and his 2 sons. Art historian Aby Warburg argued that this was the ultimate image of what he called pathos formulae, meaning the ultimate paroxysm of pain, both physical and mental, the consciousness that he's about to die, but also that his sons are struggling with him, fated as well. These sculptures create a new kind of ideal, more muscular, dynamic, and it's an ideal which impacted the Renaissance more than any other image, Michelangelo particularly. Laocoon was described by Virgil. This sculpture was described by Pliny, the Roman historian. It was buried for a century and a half, and in 1506 it was unveiled to artists of the Renaissance. Like a bolt from the blue, history returned.